This week in wrestling history, a week where Vince McMahon once wrestled God himself, and where 10 years ago WWE launched its Be a Star anti-bullying campaign. If only they would have let CM Punk finish his thought before cutting him off during that pipe bomb promo. He was just about to get to the good stuff. 44 years ago this week, on April 30th, 1977, at the Baltimore Civic Center, superstar Billy Graham defeated Bruno Sammartino to win the WWF Championship, ending Bruno's second and final run with the belt at 1,237 days, or roughly the length of a normal episode of Monday Night Raw. They chose Baltimore out of an abundance of caution. They were a little worried about what might happen if Bruno lost the belt in Madison Square Garden. This was the Pro Wrestling Illustrated Match of the Year for 1977. Graham won the title with his foot on the ropes for leverage. Ironically, he would lose the title the following year to Bob Backlund with his foot on the bottom rope, as Backlund pinned him. So, hey, you live by the sword, you die by the sword. But his loss wasn't a surprise to him, as Vince McMahon Sr., before he even won the title, told him the exact day that he would win it and the exact day that he would lose it. None of this booking week-to-week stuff that his son does. 30 years ago this week, on the April 27th, 1991 episode of WWF Superstars, in one of the more traumatic moments of my young wrestling fandom, it was Damien's demise. It all started a couple of weeks removed from WrestleMania 7. Jake had wrapped up his program, Jake the Snake that is, with the model Rick Martel. He comes to find out that the mighty Earthquake is deathly afraid of snakes, and so naturally he starts to scare him with Damien. 1 week later on Wrestling Challenge, Earthquake and Jimmy Hart drop by the barbershop. This was the very first installment of the barbershop with Brutus the Barber Beefcake, to talk about Jake, and Beefcake scares Earthquake with a rubber snake and he runs away. So now we come to the match. And it's not much of one. Jake brings Damien out of the bag. Earthquake takes off down the aisleway, but he's forced back down to the ring. And Jake is forced to put the snake bag underneath the ring. Earthquake attacks him, gets him inside, ties him up in the ropes. Not unlike what Jake would do months later to Randy Savage in another traumatic angle. Let me tell you something. Jake's stuff, especially that year, Jake's stuff really fucked me up as a kid. Jimmy Hart tackles Earl Hebner to the ground to hold him down, hence the disqualification. Earthquake slides the snake bag into the middle of the ring, and he forces Jake to watch as he hits the ropes, and he sits down on the bag. He squashes Damien to death. Jake says the angle wasn't his idea, but they wanted him to be knocked out of the ring and not see what Earthquake did. It was his idea to get tied up in the ropes instead and be forced to watch his pet brutally murdered. And you know what? He was absolutely right. It works so much better that way. Now, if you watched the original airing like I did, you saw them cut away to Sean Mooney in the event center each time Earthquake sat down on the bag. They showed the uncensored version of this on Primetime Wrestling the following week. They freed Jake from the ropes, did the referees. He untied the bag to look inside, and he was devastated by what he saw. Now, of course, Damien was not actually inside the bag. Instead, it was 60 pounds of hamburger meat stuffed inside women's pantyhose. According to Bruce Pritchard, the idea was when Earthquake sat down on the bag, blood would ooze out, but that didn't happen. Instead, Earthquake ended up with a wet spot on his ass. There's a visual for you. On Primetime Wrestling, Earthquake was a guest, and he served the hosts what they thought were hamburgers, hot off the grill. Or at least that's what they thought they were eating. That's what Vince McMahon and Lord Alfred Hayes thought. Bobby Heenan, he was chowing down on probably 3 or 4 burgers. He was laughing the whole time, talking about how you could eat them, or you can make a pair of shoes out of them. And they soon realized what they were eating was not hamburger meat, it was snake meat from Damien's dead carcass. Vince McMahon got angry. He smacked the tray full of burgers out of Earthquake's hands. Earthquake was hilarious, wearing his chef's hat. He's just eating burgers the whole time. He's got that big Chef Boyardee hat on. You know, you watch this, really you watch anything with Earthquake from this period, and it is hard to believe that he was only 27 years old when this was filmed, when this aired. He was 27. He would turn 28 a few months later. He didn't look a day over 40. But it was only a few months later that Jake turned heel, and I like to think that it was Damien's death that drove him to turn heel later that year. 26 years ago this week, on April 26, 1995, at a wrestling challenge taping in Moline, Illinois for a show to air that weekend, Triple H made his in-ring debut as Hunter Hearst Helmsley, the Greenwich Blue Blood, against convicted child molester Buck Zumhofe. He won not with a pedigree, but with an RKO. Although obviously they didn't call it that, they called it a cutter, which is what it is. For those who don't know, Zumhofe was jailed twice back in the 1980s for sexual misconduct with a minor, which apparently did not stop WWE from using him here, even after their own sex scandals involving minors. Zumhofe was arrested again in 2013. He was charged with 12 counts of criminal sexual misconduct for abusing his own daughter from 1999 to 2011. She was only 15 years old when the abuse began. The day that he was convicted, the dumb shit that he is, he tried to flee the courthouse, but he was tackled to the ground by court officers, and they tacked on even more charges. And he is currently serving 25 years. May he rot in there. 2 days later, on April 28th and again on April 29th, 1995, gave us the largest crowds ever assembled for a professional wrestling show on back-to-back days in Pyongyang Stadium in the Hermit Kingdom of North Korea as part of the World Peace Festival. Allegedly 150,000 spectators on day one, 190,000 on day two. It's amazing how many people you can get in a stadium when you're forced to attend, with the penalty of death. Maybe Dave Meltzer can get us the actual attendance number. This was the joint WCW New Japan Collision in Korea, which is getting its own Dark Side of the Ring episode this season, so I'm going to wait and go into more detail about this next month, but in their one and only match against each other, Antonio Inoki beat Ric Flair. Flair tells the story of how Scott Norton was on the phone. He was on that trip as well, and Scott was on the phone with his family. He was apparently telling them that he didn't really like being there, and all of a sudden the call went dead. Flair said the surveillance there the entire time was very intimidating. The moment they landed, they split everybody up. They took all their passports away from them. They took them to different hotels. They assigned a person to watch over them the entire time they were there. When the event was over, they kept them for several more days, and they wanted Flair to make a public statement that after his time there, he now saw how North Korea could dominate the United States if they wanted to. And Flair said that he was just, instead he said that he was just thrilled and honored to be there. And I guess that was enough to satisfy them, and he went home. 25 years ago this week, on April 28th, 1996, WWE presented its Good Friends, Better Enemies in Your House pay-per-view from Omaha. This was the final pay-per-view for both Diesel and Razor Ramon, who were on their way to WCW. Razor lost to Vader, while Diesel had no problem putting over his buddy Shawn Michaels in a no-holds-barred match for the championship, his first title defense since beating Bret Hart at WrestleMania. They had shot an angle at a house show from Madison Square Garden the month before, where Diesel, who really was the earliest tweener, I think, that WWE ever had, from that period after he lost the belt to when he left, you know, he was the cool heel. He would only smack hands with fans that wore black Diesel gloves in the audience. But there weren't really any people in the company who were sort of booked that way at that time. But he was still friends with Shawn Michaels, and so they teamed up at MSG 2 weeks before WrestleMania in a match against Bret Hart and The Undertaker, which they lost by disqualification when Diesel hit Undertaker with a chair. Then after the match was over, he hit Bret with the chair, and then he hit Shawn with the same chair, right across the back. Judas. And when Michaels was helped to the back, he was heard saying, "I'm going to kick his 7-foot ass." So that would explain why, despite losing to The Undertaker at WrestleMania, Diesel was the one who got the title match here and not Undertaker, who instead wrestled Mankind in a dark match at the end of the night. This was the greatest match of Kevin Nash's career. I don't think he ever had a better match before or after this. I think it was better than any of the matches he had with Bret Hart, which would be his other greatest matches. So wouldn't you know, his best matches came against Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels, two of the greatest workers in the history of the business. But it was a chance for the company to show that their new champion here was not just a pretty boy. He could take an ass-kicking in a hardcore match and he can give it right back. You know, Diesel had promised a surprise for Vince McMahon at ringside. Vince was doing commentary with Jerry Lawler. And his big surprise was powerbombing Shawn Michaels through the announce desk right in front of Vince. Diesel then, in the ultimate heel act, he walked over to Mad Dog Vachon sitting in the front row. He grabbed Mad Dog out of his seat, took him to the ground in a very gentle way, and he ripped his prosthetic leg off to use as a weapon. Vachon had been involved in a hit-and-run accident one day while jogging, and he had to have his leg amputated, hence the artificial leg. Also on this show, the Ultimate Warrior challenged Goldust for the Intercontinental title in a horrible match that really wasn't much of one because Goldust was injured. A few weeks earlier at a show in Dusseldorf, Germany, match against Razor Ramon, he tore the MCL in his knee, and he had to fly home early from the tour to be evaluated by Dr. Andrews in Birmingham. They were hopeful that he could work a short match here, but he really couldn't do much. So what we got was a lot of stalling by Goldust and his new bodyguard, who didn't last long after this. He was played by Mantar. Not as Mantar, that would have been better, but by the man who played Mantar. The man who played the Tar. Mike Halleck, I believe his name was. Who was given no name. He was just a guy. For the first time, this was the first time we saw him. He just walked out with Goldust that night. But he was there to take bumps. That was his job. He was there to take bumps that Goldust couldn't take from the Warrior. Warrior grabbed Marlena's cigar. He began smoking it. He put on Goldust's wig. He burned Goldust's hand with the cigar. He clotheslined him out of Marlena's director's chair. Goldust bailed. He got counted out. Not even the great Mantar could save this. 23 years ago this week, on April 26, 1998, WWE drew what was then the largest attendance for a wrestling event in the history of the Greensboro Coliseum for its Unforgiven In Your House pay-per-view, the first to be promoted using the Attitude Era scratch logo. The show gave us WWE's first ever evening gown match between two women with Sable and Luna Vachon, won by Luna, and the first ever Inferno match between Kane and The Undertaker, which was quite the spectacle to watch. Undertaker diving out over the top rope, over the flames, onto Kane and Vader outside the ring. Vader had run down. While Undertaker was off beating up Paul Bearer, the special effects folks were fitting Kane's arm at ringside with a protective sleeve for the big climactic spot where he got knocked backwards into the flames and his arm was set on fire. I mean, it looked ridiculous. Even watching it live, it looked ridiculously fake, but there's really no other safe way to do a spot like that. It's just funny, like, they cut back to ringside and there's Kane with a fucking plastic bag on his arm. It's like, again, there's no safe way, I guess, to do a spot like that, but I just wish it wasn't so obvious. And in his first title defense on pay-per-view, coming out of WrestleMania 14, Stone Cold Steve Austin lost to Dude Love via disqualification after striking a WWF official in a match where he also blasted Vince McMahon in the face with a steel chair outside the ring as McMahon was trying to help Dude Love to his feet. Was he trying to hit Dude, or was he aiming for the owner? That was the question that Jim Ross was asking as the show ended. One of the all-time great Vince McMahon bumps here. Place went apeshit for that chair shot. You know, as much as fun as this match was, they would have an even better match the following month at the Over the Edge pay-per-view. And Vince McMahon would take an equally brutal chair shot. It was bad enough that he needed dental work after the show. It was such a hard shot, it knocked the caps right off his teeth. 22 years ago, on April 26th, 1999, on an episode of WCW Monday Nitro from Fargo, North Dakota, Sting defeated Diamond Dallas Page just before the start of Hour 2 of a 3-hour show to win the WCW World Heavyweight title in a match that I included in my list of the top 15 matches in WCW history of the Turner era. It was not a ranked list, but I included that match because it was that damn good. It was a really good match. And by the way, if you want to listen to my recap of that match and all the other matches, all other 14 matches in that countdown, I have a whole playlist up on the YouTube channel, so you can find all those clips there. But they placed the match at the end of Hour 1 as a way to try to keep some of the audience that would usually flip over to the start of Monday Night Raw, and it worked. They only lost about 200,000 viewers instead of the usual 1 or 2 million that would drop off around that time. DDP had won his first WCW World title only 2 weeks before this at Spring Stampede in a 4-way against Hulk Hogan, Ric Flair, and Sting, with Randy Savage as the guest referee, and then turned heel on Nitro the very next night. It sounded like they had 30,000 people in the building that night for this match, but it was only about 11,000. Just a fun match to watch. Truly one of the very best matches in Nitro history. The people were jazzed to see Sting win the title. And there was still 2 hours left to go, which meant 2 hours left to screw it all up. Now, this happened right around the time Ric Flair was committed to a mental institution on television, not in real life, although sometimes I think he probably should have been committed to a mental institution for his own good. They sent Flair to the Funny Farm, which is where the people writing this show probably should have been sent. In Flair's absence, Charles Robinson, Lil Nate, was appointed Vice President of WCW. Yes, the referee, Charles Robinson, is now the VP of WCW. Now, mind you, Roddy Piper also thought he was in charge at that time. I don't remember the circumstances around why he thought that, but apparently he did. Flair somehow finds out about this, and he calls Lil Nate from the asylum to tell him that he's not happy about Piper wielding power, and he wants Robinson to call in the National Guard to deal with this problem. He says this while yelling at the other patients for touching his robe. Robinson subsequently has Piper arrested. He fires him from WCW. Kevin Nash then decides that he wants a 4-way main event with himself, Goldberg, DDP, and Sting for the WCW title. Flair tells Lil Nate to make the match, which I guess means that Flair was watching Nitro from the mental institution. I mean, it kind of makes sense, right? That would be the choice of programming that would be airing in such a place. In another segment from the asylum, Scott Hall made a brief cameo as a patient wearing a hospital gown, and this was never spoken of again. In the main event, which did a far smaller number than the first title match earlier in the show, Randy Savage tosses a pair of brass knucks to DDP for him to use on Kevin Nash before getting the pin and winning back the WCW title. So in the span of 2 hours, DDP lost and won back the championship. A week later, Ric Flair got bailed out of the mental hospital by Arn Anderson. You learn something new every day. See, I didn't know you could just bail somebody out of an insane asylum. You could post bond. That doesn't seem very safe. I cannot understand how this company was no longer in business just 2 years later. Now, on a more serious note, Sting was asked by WCW not to wear his trademark black trench coat to the ring that night for the match, with this show coming a week after the Columbine High School shooting massacre, where 2 deranged students were part of what they called the Trench Coat Mafia, or at least one of them. They some kind of group called the Trench Coat Mafia. A WCW spokesman said, "This tragedy has deeply affected everyone in this country. WCW is glad to help out in any way that we can." That same night, Raw is War opened with a scrolling message on the screen that read as follows. Earlier today, the World Wrestling Federation received a request from the parents of Matt Ketchter to join them tonight in remembering their son, his friends, and classmates who lost their lives in the senseless tragedy at Columbine High School. The WWF joins parents, teachers, and community leaders in recognizing the importance of banding together to meet the needs of troubled teens. Violence is never an answer. Through communication, we will hopefully find a solution. In memory of all who lost their lives, we ask everyone to join us in a moment of silence. Matt and his brother Adam were huge WWF fans, and a company spokesman said that Matt's mom told me a very poignant story. When we had our pay-per-view Sunday night, Adam was sitting at home when the doorbell rang. The Columbine football team came by to take him to a neighbor's house so they could all watch it together. And the family also got phone calls from two of their favorite wrestlers, The Rock and Mick Foley. Sadly, it has been one in a long line of school shootings in this country, which has been our great national disgrace. The following day, on April 27th, WWE taped its first ever edition, the pilot episode of a little show called SmackDown, which aired 2 days later on UPN. This was WWE's return to network television for the first time since 1992. Michael Cole and Jim Cornette did the commentary, a noteworthy show that featured the merger of the corporation and the Ministry of Darkness to form the Corporate Ministry. The show drew a 4.0 rating. It did less viewers than Raw was doing on cable at that time, or about 3.8 million viewers is what it did. UPN was averaging a little less than that at the time, so the number was good enough for them to greenlight SmackDown as a weekly series, which they did that August.